Today, the 26th day of June 2024, like every other 26th day of June any year, is the International Day in support of victims of torture. International Day in support of victims of torture. Okay? It's a UN-recognized day. And we want to have that conversation going into the next hour. We're joined by two people. Wangechi Kahuria is the Executive Director of the Independent Medical Legal Unit, and she's also the convener of the Police Reforms Working Group in Kenya. And Atiang is the Head of Programs at Usalama Reforms Forum. Jacob and Wangechi, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to have you here. Karibuni sana. This is Kenya's biggest conversation. That's a hot seat of the situation. Jacob, Usalama?
Usalama.
Mambo iko fiti?
Iko fiti.
Very good.
I am actually the CEO for Usalama Reforms Forum.
You are the CEO of Usalama Reforms Forum. Yeah. Your people didn't know this yesterday when they were telling us you are the one who's coming. They're trying to be modest. We are sending. Well, CEO of the Usalama Reforms Forum, and you'll tell us what that is all about and what you do, right? Karibuni sana to the conversation.
Thank you for having us, yes.
Siti, why don't you welcome our guests with the day's proverb?
Yes.
Jacob and Wangechi, please listen to the proverb. We'd like to hear your interpretation of this one.
Our proverbs for this week come from the Islamic Republic of Mauritania. Okay? Within the faith of Islam, there are two groups. They're the Sunnis and the Shias. There's a reason why, but that is not what we're going to look at. Mauritania practiced the Sunni brand of Islam. Okay? If you tickle the earth with a hoe, she laughs with a harvest.
If you tickle the earth with a hoe, she laughs with the harvest. I guess what's your interpretation of this?
Thank you very much for having us, and very interesting. I think two things come to mind. One, I guess, would be kind to Mother Nature, and she'll be kind to you. The second one is put in your best in everything that you do, and you will get good returns out of that. That would be my quick interpretation. And the first one actually would align to climate change conversation. I mean, the things we are doing to Mother Nature, and we have seen the wrath Mother Nature has had. So I guess that would be my interpretation.
A very good one. Yeah. Jacob, what's yours?
Thank you very much. I think my interpretation would more or less be closer to Wangechi's. Basically saying that give your best when the sun still shines. And more importantly, work for the common good of humanity, including yourself. We have seen situations where people want to fail to care about others. So care about humanity, care about the generations to come, care about yourself, and God and someone else will care about you. I think that's what I see quickly.
Good ones. Very, very good ones. So before we talk about the International Day in support of victims of torture, let's talk about the organizations, right? So we've had conversations with IMLU before, and we know the Independent Medical Legal Unit, but then there is now what you convene as the convener of the Police Reforms Working Group. Even that we've heard about it before. What is it?
Let me start with what IMLU is, because there are people probably listening in for the very first time.
Yes.
IMLU, the Independent Medical Legal Unit, is a public benefit organization that was formed to prevent and respond to all forms of torture and related violations. We are a health, governance, and human rights organization. And our work, as I've said, primarily looks at the prevention of torture, and we will be defining torture, I hope so, in a little while. Now, IMLU has been in existence for the last 30 years. Has dealt directly with survivors, people who've been victimized, violated, and have gone through different forms of torture. We provide medical, legal aid, but we are best known for documentation of torture cases. And the documentation, I would say, is one of the most important things, because without proper documentation, then you cannot get the case into a court of law. You'll not be able to even have it documented as a torture case. So we begin from that. And our mode of documenting is internally recognized. We use forensics evidence. We work through a nexus of law and science. So we are the people, we are the go-to people when it comes to torture. Now, the Police Reforms Working Group is a network of over 23 organizations in Kenya, mainly human rights governance based entities. We come together to discuss, to advocate for police reforms, because we know that our constitution, we changed the police from a police force to a police service. And the police service has a very unique mandate: the protection of Kenyans, the protection of the rule of law, fulfillment of the constitution. And so this network upholds the police service in regards to their mandate, and we demand accountability on what the police service does. So again, we coalesce and we provide that platform to also contribute to making the service a better service. So that is what the Police Reforms Working Group is. We have played a big role, for example, in contributing to the Maraga Task Force recommendations that would make the service, deliver better and serve the citizens of this great land of ours in a much better way. So that is what we are.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll talk about the working group and what you've been doing so far later. Jacob, Usalama Reforms Forum. I know Usalama means security, does it?
Yes.
Okay. What's the Usalama Reforms Forum?
Thank you very much, Eric. Usalama Reforms Forum is, of course, a civil society organization that was formed out of need just before 2011. Loosely formed as a security sector engagement platform, because at that point in time there was need for people to coalesce around the re-engineering of and implementation of the 2010 Constitution. You remember just before 2010, a lot of discussions, deliberations around the new Kenya that we wanted then. So come 2010, August 27th, we have a new constitution. Then we started the journey there. So that was just the beginning of the journey. So as an institution and many others, we then realized, yes, we had a 2010 constitution, a very nice basic foundation, but the journey needed to be started. So what did we need to do? There needed to be a lot of institutional reforms, many sectors, if you like. So we narrowed down quickly into governance and security sector reforms, institutional arrangements. So that is how Usalama was formed. So Usalama has been working around security, governance, research, but basically largely around the issues of police reforms and public participation in terms of security and governance, because we realized that since 2010 Constitution, one of the major gains around the Constitution is public participation. So how do you get people into these conversations? How do they participate? How do they contribute? But more importantly, how are their needs and interests taken forward? So that is part of what we have been doing for the last couple of years.
Okay. We'll get more into that practically as we now talk about torture. But let's begin with the definitions. What is torture, Wangechi?
Actually, as we begin this conversation, I had wanted us to, at some point, observe a minute silence for those that have fallen due to torture. But torture is primarily any form of violence, be it physical or otherwise. And I want to emphasize or otherwise, because it could be mental. A lot of times we ignore the mental pain that is caused on an individual. So it's any form of violence meted out on a person by state agents, especially when they want to get some information from the person or to stop the person from doing an act act that they wanted to undertake, and it has significant implications and consequences on that person's life. So that is the basic definition of torture. It's important.
You said by the state. So are we saying that torture then can only be meted out on somebody by the state?
The international definition of torture is actually by state agencies, by duty bearers. And that's a very important understanding to have. So it's a person who is in a position of power is paid through tax. Funds that are generated from the country mechanism of collecting money. So they are paid by the state, so it's our money. And they then perpetrate the violation in their capacity as state agents.
Okay. And it does not have to be physical.
And it does not have to be physical. In fact, most of the times, a lot of forms of torture are not physical. It's heavy intimidation. It is torture like what we are seeing. You get arrested arbitrarily. You get, they drive around with you. Nobody knows where you are. You can imagine, put yourself in the shoes of this person. At that moment when you're in this car, we don't even know what kind of car it is. But you're in this car. Incommunicado, you cannot communicate to anybody. They're driving around with you. These are people in positions of power. You are a kawaida citizen, allow me to use these words, just to bring it home. Can you imagine the pain, the agony, the mental anguish this person is going through?
A lot.
So a lot of torture is actually more mental and very traumatic than necessarily the blood that we see, the broken arm, the head injuries. All those are forms of torture, but we overlook the mental torture.
Which is a lot. But also,
heavy.
Many times we think of it from the security sector.
Right.
Can we think about then mental torture from denial of service?
Absolutely.
So say you've gone to a hospital and you do not get the service that you require, and you're sitting there and for example, that you're hypertensive, you're not seeing a doctor on time, you're sitting on the queue, you're not getting the medication that you need, or it's an emergency, you've been rescued from an accident and you've been taken to a health facility and you're not seeing the health professionals on time. Is that torture?
It is torture. Actually, the question to ask ourselves is, why do we have public officers? Let's start from there. It is to offer a service to the citizens of Kenya. Now, when you as a public servant do not offer that service, and in this case, let's take the question you've asked, you are denied medical services. That's a great form of torture because your only hope of treatment is a government service provider. So if they don't provide that service to you, they're actually denying you your right. Remember, we are discussing human rights as well. And just going back a little bit, right now we have a case we are dealing with of torture victims of the 1982 coup. And they were awarded by a court. A court ruled in their favor for compensation. They have never been compensated. Is that torture? Of course it is torture. You're denying them their right to a livelihood. They have been kept in the dark for so long. These guys have been isolated, stigmatized by society. So that's the broader definition of torture. But we, a lot of times, just narrow torture to what we see. But torture is heavy on the pain inflicted that we do not see.
So even pending bills, that's torture?
I mean, that's a conversation we can have. That's a conversation we can have. Yes. But I guess you understand it's what causes pain to a person. Let's begin there. So it's that which causes pain to a person because of an act that has been done to you or denied. You know. So
So I mean, it's a double question here. So usually we can only establish torture after it has occurred, is it not?
Yes, mostly. But there are ways to prevent it. So we have mechanisms for prevention of torture, and we have ways to prevent it, and we can actually prevent it if we want to. Yes.
In the definition, again, going back to saying state, then it is also known across the world that states have been known to employ mechanisms or elements of torture for their own information and, collection.
Yes.
It's a practice.
Absolutely.
It's known. Do we have, because if this is a global definition and we know that institutions frown on it, is it accepted that states have as themselves accepted that they will use this to then be able to get information or pass a message or to teach a lesson?
Actually, the international definition of torture also states that no form of torture is acceptable, whichever way, and you can never justify torture.
And yet, states use them as mechanisms. Yes, states use them. Yeah. So this is where the problem is. The convention is clear. You know, the UN Convention Against Torture, Cruel, Inhumane, Degrading Treatment is there. And the definitions are clear. And countries have signed into this. But they will still use torture so that they get information from people they suspect have the information. A lot of times these people don't even have that information, I can tell you. I mean, because we've worked in this sector for pretty long. So yes, it is being used. It is against international law. And I'll give you the story of Kenya. The convention of the UN convention was signed in 1987. We only signed it in Kenya in 1997, 10 years later. So 10 years lapse. It was domesticated in 2017. That's another 20 years later. So in regards to our commitment to human rights protection, there's a big question there. And then, of course, when you come to the operationalization, then we even have a bigger question. Yeah. Can we look at the Kenya example? The victims of torture in Kenya. There are those who've gone through and come out on the other side and told horror stories of what they have been through. What has been the state response? Because I'm sure you've told us Usalama involved in this. What has been the state response to those who've come out of the other side? We know that some have not. Unfortunately, we know that some have died. But for those who have come out and talked about what they've been through, what has been the state response, Kenya now, in terms of what it will or will not allow moving forward? We know the famous stories of the torture chambers. We know what has happened to people under the hands of police. What's the state response, or what's the state stance today as concerns torture?
Thank you very much. I think you'd imagine that the state, as it were, Kenya, in terms of what would I call academically, the Kenyan government says they are government that protects human rights and also respects the constitution. But just back to what Wangechi was saying, so that in terms of torture, as she has mentioned, we have seen a very big challenge around mental and emotional impact of torture. Because as she says, yes, of course, there's a lot of visible physical torture that we see around, injuries, deaths and so on and so forth. But the emotional torture, the mental impact of torture is massive. As Usalama, we have seen and done research around the burden of torture to families and communities and friends and so on and so forth. It is huge and it is massive, because you have families that maybe they are breadwinners, maybe your children, maybe your family, your wife, your husband, your mother, name it. When they go through all this, even though the first person may be physically affected, the entire family gets emotionally and psychologically impacted on torture. But back to your question, so that I respond to it. The government of Kenya has what is called the State of Human Rights report that they deliver to the UN every year. It is basically ticking the boxes. They say, yes, we have done this. As Wangechi has said, it took us 10 years to domesticate the international human rights law. And as we speak today, operationalization of the Anti-Torture Act has not taken effect are now 20 years since we domesticated. You know, you domesticate, then you operationalize. So we have a law that is very good in the books, ready to go. But Erica can tell you, if you talk to the victims of torture, in fact, now they don't call themselves victims because they have suffered enough. So now they call themselves survivors, and we agree that we don't want to call them victims because then we stigmatize them more. So we are now calling them survivors of torture. So if you talk to survivors of torture, their families and their next of kin, as Eric was saying, you are under medication, you go to hospitals, you don't get drugs because a government or someone who was supplying has not supplied the drugs. You are in and out of hospital for weeks, for months. You lose hope. So the burden of the impact of torture is huge. But as I was saying, government every year wants to say the state of human rights, including torture survivors as well. They are very badly off. As Wangechi mentioned, any person who goes to court for compensation, especially the survivors, when they get a good court ruling to compensate, those who are lucky enough get compensated between 5 to 7 years later. After the ruling, you get your ruling and you are served with the ruling. So you should be compensated the following day. Imagine following up your compensation for 6 years after having struggled with the case as a survivor for another 6 years. So we are talking about a decade here of struggle to get this. When the compensation comes, I am told, it comes in pieces again. It doesn't come as a complete package. Again, it could come as now we see the government disbursing funds. So it might come 80%. Then they'll tell you the next financial year we are going to finish this by the last 20%. So it is long, it is difficult, it is unimaginable.
Okay. Today, the 26th day of June 2024, is the International Day in support of victims of torture. So we say now, let's use the proper wording here, survivors. Of torture. It's a UN recognized day, and our guest this morning, Wangechi Kahuria, she's the executive director at IMLU and also the convener of the Police Reforms Working Group, and Jacob Atiang, who is the CEO of the Usalama Reforms Forum. As we go into this break, there's a message from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres as we are marking the International Day of Torture. I am deeply saddened by the reports of deaths and injuries, including of journalists and medical personnel, connected to protests and street demonstrations in Kenya. I urge the Kenyan authorities to exercise restraint and call for demonstrations to take place peacefully.
When I hear of compensation, and we're talking about harm that was actually inflicted by the individuals, by the government, compensation has to go through a process. And there's a budget for it. Money is set aside. That's how it works. Now, are we saying that the money that is set aside is also minuscule? It is in installments, or is it that the money is actually set aside as prescribed by the courts? Because it is the courts that make these awards.
Thank you very much, Muga. I think from where we sit, from a human rights perspective, you don't need to harm someone to compensate them. So the question around compensation is basically deterrent, so that you don't get there. But if by bad luck, Muga, you are an old man, unfortunately, if you get there, if you harm my child, if unfortunately you get there, then you have overreached the deterrence. But back to the question, yes, from the courts, from what we know, the compensation should come as soon as there's a verdict from the courts, because then it is the same. Remember, the government is the duty bearer, and we put government in place to protect the right of citizens. So that is the primary basic responsibility of government. So you need to protect, you need to uphold, so that you don't go into the question of the cost of compensation. But as I've said, if by bad luck you get there, there are a lot of money. So we have seen a lot of wastage in terms of government expenditure, Eric, and you have been on this subject. You have even interviewed His Excellency, the President, I think sometime this year, when we are talking about the state of the nation and the question around accountability, public resources and wastage. So there are a lot of money that the government has, but there's a lot of wastage that goes on. So according to the courts, according to the human rights standard, yes, there's enough money. All you need to do is comply with the court verdict and compensate at once and, if possible, immediately.
I have a problem. And my problem is, the way we've defined torture is if a person working for a state agency, not the state agency, so maybe the state agency or a person working in the state agency, then commits torture, physical or emotional or in whatever form, they are the ones who've committed the torture, right? And I am the victim of their action. Now, if a chief decides to come and they're extorting people because they're making changa, and the chief goes ahead and beats up somebody, and they arrest them and they take them to the chief's camp, and that person is tortured by the chief and his officers, and it's not a government policy or any sanction from Harambee House that says, you know, conduct this crackdown and this is how you shall conduct it. That's the chief and the officer. If the court awards this victim some compensation, why should the rest of us taxpayers pay
Actually,
for the actions of this individual who went and decided they want to torture?
That has been a big debate for some time, and thank you for bringing that up. And because all nations are, democracies are growing every time, there has been a lot of debate around that. And yes, we discovered that at the beginning we would slap the government entirely with those kind of blames and complaints. Now the law requires, for if you are a state agency and at the point when a court decides that such so and so was tortured, the government now has some internal administrative mechanism to deduct your salary and your benefits to bridge the gap. The government will still compensate. I hope you get it right. But come back to Eric's, Latif's, pay slip and deduct for the cost to compensate for the cost of payment. Because as you are saying, that is the fact of the matter. This chief would have then to forgo a section of his or her salary for a number of years to get back to the total cost for which he cost the government to really pay for that. So that is the current situation. So the practicality could be a bit difficult, but that's the state as it was.
So are we saying that this chief or whichever government official is actually being made to pay the cost for a mistake they made of their own volition or for obeying instructions?
Their own volitions. Remember, liabilities to an individual, if you go to the court of law, and if you look at the TORs of government officers, especially public servants, the terms of references are very clear. This is what you must do, this is what you must not do. For example, if I am a police officer and I have a gun and I have my boss ordering me to shoot Wangechi, I have a responsibility to restrain, not to shoot. Why? Because individual liability will come back to me, will not go to my boss, because of the high value that we put into human rights and the right to life and especially protection of our constitution. So it goes to some limits, but she can explain.
Yeah, let me add to that, because there are two levels. There's obviously the individual liability, but there's also, especially for police, there's command responsibility. If you are in charge of the station or the control and you issue the orders, then you have responsibility and the liability is upon you. But there's also the individual liability. Now, there are two things, going back to your question, that we don't seriously analyze what some of the actions our state agents, officers and public officers do and the implications they have on the citizens. Because it is true, our tax will end up going to pay compensation on something that should never have happened. Look at what happened yesterday. The truth is there are going to be numerous court cases. Okay? Now, at one point or another, the government will also have to spend, because they're going to be put on the stand. So who will cover that? Where's that money going to come from? So there are those implications that we don't think through. That's taxpayers' money. But beyond that, and just getting back to the conversation and the day and why we are here, even as we discuss this responsibility, is the fact that these officers are supposed to be trained. Again, we invest in training government officers. Police are trained how to use, use of lethal force. They are trained on how to manage crowd control, public order management. They are trained. We invest. So if the government is investing, but there are no results to that investment, then why put in taxpayers' money into a process that is not yielding results? I'm just struggling conversation because there's no need of us investing into systems and structures that do not work to the benefit of the citizens of this country.
Okay. So, looking at these conversations from that level, but then also looking pointedly at what happened over the last few days, I just want to ask a question, and maybe now you can get an answer and I can go to the next one. How long does somebody have to be interrogated, kept away, for it to be deemed that there's a torturous situation that was happening? How long? A minute? An hour? 24 hours?
Torture even a minute.
Okay.
It's the action. It's the act.
It's the act.
It's the act.
And then it will be deemed as torture,
yes,
is it not?
Yes.
Okay. And that there are certain protocols, by nature of us being an international community, that Kenya has ratified.
Yes.
And says that we will be bound by this as a result of us seeing the danger of it, and we don't want to be part of that, right? We've seen a couple of things happening over the last few days where individuals, in their own capacity as citizens of this country, have spoken out, have demonstrated, have protested, have lobbied, have picketed, but then they've disappeared.
Yeah.
There are some that have been returned, but there are some who right now have still not returned. We do not know what's happening to them. We do not know where they are. And that there are armed individuals who've taken them. That has been seen. It's not conjecture. It can be seen. In a state that has ratified at least one treaty for the protection of in this case, they are victims because it has not happened, or we do not know what has happened. What should be, according to what you've been bound by, what should be the response when we are seeing 6, 7, 8 people that we know of disappeared in that nature, and they're not being called to have a secret cup of tea?
Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah. Actually, by yesterday, because we are monitoring, we are on the ground, we have a situation room where members of the 23 organizations in the Police Reforms Working Group and others, many others, that's housed at the Kenya National Human Rights Commission is monitoring. But yesterday we had 23 cases of arbitrary arrests and what I would call disappearance, because we don't know where they are. As you say, some were returned. Now, we should, some protocols on what should happen. So when you are arrested, let me just use that word for the sake of using it, assuming they were arrested, but we know it's not an arrest, it's not an official arrest, because we have 53 that were arrested officially, so those are arrests. This one's disappeared. Now, when you disappear, when you are picked up, you have a right to know why you're being picked up. Who is picking you up? Do they identify themselves? Are you given the authority, the potential to look for a lawyer, an advocate for, so that they know and they can take up your case? All those protocols have not been observed. And what is sad, and I came here personally with a very sad heart, a very, very heavy heart, because we're talking of loss of lives. We are talking about arbitrary arrests. We are talking about cries from Kenyans. The whole week, let us know where so-and-so is. Yesterday, we kept calling and saying, can you release them if you're not holding them legally? The CJ herself issued a statement that tells you how serious this thing is. And so you cannot hold somebody, and that is what I was saying, the silent forms of torture.
Right.
You're holding this person, they don't even, some of them do not know why they're being held. We are saying you're leaders of a movement. Who is a leader of a movement? Which movement? What did you organize? So going back to Article 37 of the Constitution, the right to association, to picket, to voicing yourselves. Why are we Kenyans? What is a government? By the people, for the people? I thought that it was. That's what I was taught in school. And so I have a right to voice my opinion on things, to give my perspective on things. Right. But if I'm going to be arrested because of my voice, honestly, and I just want to go back to what torture is. The minute you violate my dignity because I have voiced myself, as Wangechi have said, I don't think I should be paying that tax. What's a crime in that?
Even if I think I should be paying it, but I'm uncomfortable,
Exactly.
I can voice my uncomfortability.
Exactly.
Can I not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we have crossed a very bad line, and we are violating the very constitution that we so, are proud of. And we need to call the government out. I honestly are sitting here to call the government out today because these 6,000 victims of torture IMLU has seen over the years of its operation are growing by the day. We just issued a report on 28th of February this year on the Mandamanos. Our report was called Death, Blood and Tears. 67 Kenyans died. Now, between this week, the whole of this week, I don't want to give numbers here because we are still going on with the situation monitoring. At the end of this, we're going to be reporting X other numbers. Is it necessary? Why use of force? Why use of live bullets? The convention is clear. You cannot use lethal force. You cannot use live ammunition unless it is a last resort.
So what are we So what are we talking about in a situation whereby, again, the ratification of a treaty, a ratification of protocol, ratification of a convention means that you're bound and that there would be consequences if the opposite of what you've ratified is actually happening in country?
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback on that. Then there's a constitution.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the rights that are clearly stipulated and enshrined in the constitution.
Yes.
We've got institutions that are there to make sure that these things happen.
Yes.
We have, it's how many years now? It's 14 years of this constitution.
Right.
And immediately after promulgation of the constitution, one of the first things that started was this police reform story.
Yes.
So call it police force. No. Call it police service.
Yes.
It is now working to serve the people. Let's restructure it. We are actually going to have now a commission that manages the police service. We are going to have an inspector general who is answerable to the commission. We are going to have another commission that looks at the excesses of the police service and deals with them from a human rights perspective. We've got all these organizations that have come together as a reforms working group. And yet, 14 years later, you're still reporting more and more of this happening. We are still seeing a Chief Justice who says, come on, we are seeing a gross and blatant violation of our laws and our constitution and our institutions. And yet, like you said, Wangechi, we are spending money on reforms. We are spending money on Maraga task force. We have spent money on the Kavuludi going and vetting all the police officers. Now let's vet them afresh. We are spending money on training the police on how to be a service and not a force. What's happening?
Blatant abuse of office,
By who?
disrespect to the rule of law,
By who?
disregard to the constitution by the authorities.
Yeah,
Who is committing all this?
Yeah, but I think in addition to what Wangechi is saying, Eric, I think you will observe very keenly that in Kenya specifically, we have a lot of challenges of what I call clawing back the gains that we make. So as a citizen, as a country, we are very alive to the fact that, yes, we have made gains. We make progress as a country, but the duty bearers, the state, has an intention to claw back those gains every time they have an opportunity. So that is what has been happening at the...
What's the point of establishing those institutions in the constitution that should make sure that we are safeguarding against this? We've got the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights.
Yes.
Their job is basically to make sure that there are no excesses.
Yes.
We've got the Commission on Administrative Justice.
Yeah.
Their job is to make sure that if you can any issue with you can complain and something can be done. You've got the judiciary and the NCAJ that brings in all these criminal justice actors together. We've got an independent director of public prosecutions. We've got a DCI who should be somehow independent.
And
what's the point of having all these things?
You have community-based organizations, you have non-governmental organizations who are supposed to be working together with, or even extra judiciary, who are supposed to be working to make sure these things don't happen.
And they are continuing to happen.
And yet, they continue to happen.
Bodies are showing up in rivers.
And
Bodies are showing up in landfills all over. People are being shot in open sight.
And
Why?
then it's really sad, because if you look at what happened then, Maandamano time and now, there'll be no recognition. Number one, so far there hasn't been that the government has had its
Violated
Yes.
the people.
and let me tell you, a lot of times we ask survivors, what is justice to you? And some say, I just want the government to acknowledge that they violated my rights.
Yeah.
I just want an apology. A lot of them are not even looking for the compensation, by the way. Now, if you look at the levels of impunity, very, very high. The lack of service provision, because if somebody is injured and your state officers did that, then provide them with the necessary services that are required, medical, legal, whatever it is, psychosocial support. I'm telling you, we struggle to raise resources to support survivors.
You know what it looks like? You know what it seems like to me? That we're just chasing tails here.
Yeah.
That such grievous things can happen.
Yeah.
Like, we're waking up this morning, going to bed last night with gunshots in Githurai.
Yeah.
And that mothers and fathers are screaming for the lives of their children. Children are screaming for the lives of their parents until people were chanting. And this morning, unconfirmed or not, we've got 22 people dead. We don't know the details of what happened.
Yeah.
But we do know that on this earth, on this planet, that there are jurisdictions whereby police and security forces who are armed have a bit of holdback because they know we can't do this. We can't actually do this.
Yeah.
So what needs to happen to get to that point whereby armed security forces know, hold on a minute, there are enough guardrails up from these institutions that Eric has mentioned and these other ones, there are enough guardrails up that it has done something to my psyche where I realize, number one, it is wrong. Number two, it abrogates rights. Number three, it is torturous. In my opinion, there are no guardrails. Because anybody who wants to wield a gun and is supposed to be a protector of the people can do it with such wanton abandon. We have more problems than we can even imagine. More problems than we can begin to imagine. That people are looking to you for protection, but then you become the one who is brandishing the evil. This is a major problem.
Yeah.
How do we move from here? How do we move to a point where we cannot say that people coming out to speak to you are criminals
I think
and vagabonds just because they came out to speak?
To speak.
And you shot at them.
And killed them.
You killed them. You shot them in the back. You killed a health worker who's offering aid to somebody who's been injured by your officer. And then you say, these are criminals.
Yeah, you can imagine, for example, Eric on Sunday, they abducted a young doctor who was volunteering services to the victims. And the Kenya Medical Practitioners Union had to come out. So I think by 7 p.m., the entire team was there and he was released. But back to your question, this is something that we may not have a rubber bullet the answer to it. But I think from where I sit, there are a few things that need to happen. The first thing is that you need the goodwill, not just from the state, but from the head of state to crack this matter, because the buck stops with the head of state. If you have the head of state that has a goodwill to uphold human rights, the rest will follow suit. That's one. But two, for me, this is why I'm saying from where I sit, we have a big problem around culture and attitude. So we must invest in culture and attitude change, because when I was young and growing back in my neighborhood, we used to play football. When one of us was injured, the first thing, we were the first aid to that person. We would take him, and this was a very small primary school level. We had our childhood friends. If your friend was hurt, you would take them to the next place and the support will find you there. So I'm talking about an entire regime around culture and attitude. What are we planting in our people that when they hold guns, they want to shoot a young man who is actually unarmed, voicing for their own concern, but more importantly, running away from the danger. You realize most of the young people were shot from behind and on the back. So it means they had seen the danger, they had voiced their conduct, but more importantly, they were running away from that danger so that they could, secure their lives, and they were shot from the back. So you need an entire culture change, but probably you might need God also to come down to us to support our leaders to realize that. Because look at what is happening. You might think that you are in power today. Eric, you know very well. There are people who were in power the other day that are now being hoarded around the same state. So
victims of this last 2-3 years ago are perpetrators of this today. And it's a cycle that keeps going on. Our time is up. We've got to conclude the conversation at this point. So I'm going to give you just 30 seconds to give us your remarks on this.
Let me just say that first, what is happening is gross human rights violations. It has to end. And I want to speak to especially the police sector. Please stop using live ammunition on protestants. You cannot do that. There's absolutely no justification for what you're doing. It has to stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Wangechi Kahuria, Executive Director of IMLU and Convener of the Police Reforms Working Group, and Jacob Atiang, the CEO of Usalama Reforms Forum. It's an International Day in support of victims of torture.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.